Thank you for that nice introduction, Judy. I am the immediate past president of Los Osos Rotary Club, and I'm going to introduce our distinguished panel. In the interest of time, I will keep the introductions brief, as we could spend an entire hour listing the contributions each one of these panelists have made to combat human trafficking. So, and of course, we have the bios and contact information on the tables. Yes. All the way in. Okay, there. Let's do, can you hear me in the back? Okay, great. So we also will have a little time for, hopefully have a little time for questions, so you can fill out a card and hand them off to one of the collectors. At my far left, we have San Luis Obispo County Sheriff Ian Parkinson. San Luis Obispo County District Attorney Dan Dow, who is also the founder and chair of the San Luis Obispo County Human Trafficking Task Force. Next is Deepa Willingham. She's the past governor of Rotary International District 5240 and founder of PACE Universal. And we have Bex McVeigh from Freedom Calling Organization and the Lucia Mar School District Human Trafficking Health Class Presentator. And arriving shortly, we hope that our State of California District 35 Assemblyman Jordan Cunningham will be here. So each of you brings a unique skill set and expertise in the battle against human trafficking in our community. Today, I would like our audience to get a good feel for how it is you all work together and support each other by the collection and passing on of information and your actions. In our format today, we'll have allotted up to 5 minutes for each of you to describe your part in building awareness and combating human trafficking. Sheriff Parkinson, I'd like to start with you. You and your deputies are the eyes and ears of this problem. You're on the street 24/7, 365, and we appreciate everything you do. Can you tell us from your perspective the scope of this problem in San Luis Obispo County, and specifically, are we seeing signs of an organized element such as gangs engaging in trafficking?
If you don't mind, I'm going to stand up because I feel like I'm going to get stuck in this chair.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'd like to start off and just say first, thank you for everybody being here. The chief, no, it's okay. I'll just stand. Thanks, Jody. The chief, fire chief, and all the organizers out here, to walk into a room full of people like this is truly amazing, and this is probably the single most important thing that we can do as a community in identifying what is occurring out there every day that we truly are not aware of, and it's happening right underneath our nose. Second, the partnerships that we have are absolutely vital, and oftentimes we think of partnerships as the DA's office, the police departments, and everything else, but it goes so far beyond that in this issue, because trying to understand how big the problem is extremely difficult when we're not seeing it every single day. I think the partnerships also include every single one of you in the audience, and probably beyond the level that you might think, or maybe now you understand. And what I mean by that is, you know, law enforcement only has so many people out on the street. And many times we're not seeing the same things you are every day in the community. So identifying those instances out on the street are so vitally important in order to save a victim and really identify the perpetrator in these cases. We know this problem is growing. We know the statistics. I'm sure you've probably heard them already, but the problem in California is huge. We live in an amazing spot here on the Central Coast, and we're very fortunate to really have a low crime level, and so that has a tendency to make us complacent in some of these things. what we have identified really over the last several years is that we began to identify cases locally, one right up the road here in Cayucas that I'm sure the DA will talk about, that are occurring every day in our backyard. The other thing that's really contributing to it is the fact that we are a tourist community. Whether you're talking up in the North County and the wineries, or you're talking the coastal area, we have many, many hotels, and it's prime ground for sex slavery. So every day that you're either working out in the community or you're passing by these businesses, you can clearly identify that there is something that just doesn't look right. And I always tend to use that because people want to know specifically, what does this person look like? Well, unfortunately, we don't have a mugshot that we can put up on the wall and say, this is what they all look like, so when you see this person, this is the person you're after. They come in all shapes and sizes. So I always say it's that suspicious behavior, it's the indicators that some things just don't seem right that prompts you to call us. One of the things that is quite alarming to us is that gangs have entered the market and really taken over the market in a lot of ways. And it's actually become more profitable than their narcotic sales. The challenge is, again, going back to this county, when we look at this county and we say, well, we really don't have a big gang problem. And yeah, and I think the more we say that, the more people believe it. And I really believe that when you stop saying that, you start opening your eyes to what's really occurring in our community. And I think we do a very good job of dealing with our gangs. But all it takes is a very short period of time before gangs actually take over. And then they're out of control, and we have examples all over us. And we're surrounded by some heavy gang-infested areas that are bleeding into our county every day. So I will mention that the gang task force, we have a gang task force that's larger than the gang task force in Monterey County, larger than the gang task force in Santa Barbara County combined. So we put a lot of effort into that. One of the main focuses this next year for gangs, or for the gang task force, is human trafficking. They've all been trained and educated on it. We are like you. We have to be educated on it as well. The more we hear this stuff, the more we hear from survivors, the more we hear their experiences and telltale signs, because it's not always simple, the better off we are. So our unit is actually focused on trying to erase this element in this county the best we can, and it starts with education, it starts with the community cooperation, and moves on. I've just been cut off. So I'm gonna pass the mic. Great. But thank you. I'm sure we'll have question and answer time.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. All right. Mr. Dow, thank you for dedicating so much of your energy to this problem. You will be participating in this afternoon's panel, where you will have more opportunity to talk about the task force you created. Could you describe for us, as District Attorney, the challenges and efforts your office is involved in on an ongoing basis to battle human trafficking in our community?
Sure, thank you. Probably first and foremost is a little bit about what the sheriff just talked about, and about all of you in this room. It's educating the community that we have a problem in our community. And I'm really proud of the results of the last 4 years that we've had our task force going with our community outreach program, that many, many more people now understand it's happening in our community. Our juries, as Opal talked about, have to understand the different dynamics, because quite frankly it's foreign to most of us when you hear about the kind of victimization that a victim is going through. It's hard for a juror who has to sit and listen to that to even imagine that it's possible. How could this even happen to a person in our community? And so a big benefit of our education is the fact that you, as citizens and as voters, you will be called upon to be jurors. And so now you're not in the dark about this topic, but you have a better understanding. And so education is a big piece of it. When it comes to prosecution, We have an ethical obligation as prosecutors to only go forward with cases that we can prove by evidence that's admissible in court to a burden. Our burden of proof is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So for all of you who have been on a jury, you know that's a pretty high burden. And so while we'd love to file every case that comes through that we believe someone committed a crime, we can't do it unless we have enough evidence to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. These cases are difficult. They're complex. Oftentimes the survivors are not willing to testify, or they don't want to testify. Sometimes they're much like survivors of sexual assault or domestic violence. There's too much pain there to really want to have to go through and tell your story again to another person. So we have challenges in that respect as well. And if we don't have a case that's prosecutable, that's probably one of the more difficult things for us to have to do, is to say we can't go forward. But I'm thankful that we have partnerships with our own Victim Witness Assistance Center, and we've got our staff here at a table, and I see Beth, who is on our Human Trafficking Task Force back here. They are working with every victim of crime in our community, but specifically with human trafficking victims, to make sure that they have the kind of resources they need, whether or not we can go forward and prosecute. But I think it's important to tell that reality that we can't prosecute each and every case. And more with the technology that's being used to recruit and to enlist the victims, as Opal was talking about, through the internet and through all these websites. I'm really proud that last year we started a cyber forensic laboratory that's a partnership between all the law enforcement agencies in our community and Cal Poly and the California Department of Justice. It's housed out at Camp San Luis Obispo. But we're able now to take phones and computers and look at the dark web and mine information that's there to collect evidence so that we can prove more of these cases in court. And it takes training by law enforcement and expertise and the technology and the hardware and the software, and always being adaptable, because the technology and the apps that they're putting out there and the websites are changing on a daily basis. So that's one of the biggest challenges that we have, I think, is collecting the evidence in a way that makes a case provable. And I'll end with the fact that the demand is so high that I think it's important that we talk about the education. In our community, one of the cases that we're currently prosecuting, a young teenage victim was taken to over 20 residences in the city of San Luis Obispo over a 2-day period. So if there's a demand that's that high, being filled by just one victim in one case that we have, we know that there's a pretty high demand. And so the more that we can talk about it, and my commitment as well is to make sure that the purchasers, are talked about in the community. I want people to know that if they're online looking for this kind of thing, that there's a good chance that their face is going to be put out in the community, and their name, and it can be any type of person in the community, quite frankly. It's not always the people that you saw the mugshots on the wall. It can cross every spectrum of socioeconomic status. And so I think it's important that we as a community say this kind of thing is not tolerated in our community. And if we find you out, we're going to expose it, because if we can reduce the demand, there'd be no more slavery, right? If people weren't seeking it out, then we wouldn't have this conference that we'd even have to put on to talk about it. So I would encourage each one of you to help us to decrease the demand. All right, I'll yield back the rest of my time.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Dow. Deepa, with your extensive experience working with young girls and saving perhaps thousands from a life of being trafficked, you know as well as anyone how difficult it is to treat or rehabilitate a survivor. Could you comment on your efforts in this area and perhaps highlight the difficulties of extracting victims from the life and explain to us what a safe house is?
Again, good morning, everyone. And I, like my previous colleagues here, I am happy to see this wonderful crowd. Please give Judy and Bonnie a big hand for organizing this. And I'm particularly encouraged to see many men in the group. My husband tells me that I am never going to solve this problem unless I get men to change the ways that they're behaving in many parts of the world. I, like Opal, I'm retired. I have a few, those of you who are Rotarians know, I have a few screws loose up here. I didn't know any better, but I got involved in doing this when I became 60. Becoming 60 made me very unhappy that I hadn't done anything to make the planet a better place. So talking to my Rotary Club and to my family, I started an organization called PACE Universal. PACE stands for Promise of Assurance to Children Everywhere. I too believe that if we don't treat our children well, we haven't done much as human beings. Anyway, involved in doing this, it has become a major hub where Rotarians from all over the world are going and trying to learn how to counteract it. But the process involves 4 steps: awareness, prevention, recovery, and restoration. And right now, Leonard wants me to talk about restoration. After many years of starting the PACE Learning Center, we discovered it's a day school where we started our work where they were selling 5- and 6-year-old girls for prostitution out of desperation, okay? Because their families lived in abject poverty. Girls were not valued, and I stopped it by doing what I did. But it is a day school. It is a day school, but we found that I particularly wanted a day school because I wanted the families, particularly fathers, not to value, to value their girl children. And so, but we found that there were several girls that were in desperate situation of almost being sold or being abandoned. So we decided that we needed to create a residential facility. So I applied for a grant, and you remember the movie Best Exotic Marigold Hotel? Those people gave me an award for Marigold Award for Good. With that money, we set up a safe house. SAFE stands for Sanctuary Abode for Education. So we take up all the girls and women that are in high risk, and we have a residential facility. And what Leonard wants me to talk about is the restoration portion of that 4-step process. First, you have to give them a safe environment to stay in. You have to provide for their meals and health and so on. But the most important part of our program is the mental, healing them mentally, healing their souls. And the way we do this is we use art therapy, animal therapy, music therapy, and particularly theater therapy. They are writing plays about their own lives. The recent play a little girl wrote, a teenage girl who's in our school, it was called Right Touch. By the way, let me back up a little. I speak all over the United States and all over the world on this topic. In the United States, people are still telling me, oh, I didn't know it was happening here. I thought it was only Southeast Asia. Awareness is very important. That's why this meeting is so important. Anyway, the girl wrote a play called Right Touch. She acted, and they enacted it in front of the perpetrators. Okay, they came in, the old girl pretended to be an old uncle and brought a little gift for a little girl, tiny girl who was in our nursery. And she gave the uncle gave the little toy to the little girl, and the little girl had never received a gift. So she starts playing with it, and pretty soon the uncle says, do you like the toy? And the little girl says, yes. And so he says, okay, come and give me a hug. And the hug starts in the normal hug, and then the hand goes down. And the girls wrote this play and enacted it in front of their parents and the village people. That's an incredible, powerful tool for healing a hurt soul. So that's part of what we are doing at Safe House. And the experience of Safe House is what brought me in touch with Dan I am now working with both Santa Barbara County Human Trafficking Task Force. As a matter of fact, as soon as I leave here, there's a big fundraiser going on in Santa Barbara, which PACE is a sponsor of. They are trying to create a 2-bed transition house for adult victims. Nationally, there are only 300 beds available for adult victims. So that's what we are involved with. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Bex, we have heard from law enforcement, prosecution, treatment, and recovery. Now let's talk about education and prevention. Tell us a little bit about your work with Freedom Calls and about your groundbreaking work with the Lucia Mar School District.
Great. Awesome. Hi, and just again, thank you all for being here. This is kind of what we're touching on right now, is something that I've heard throughout, so just super appreciative of the need for awareness, and part of that is starting with the people that we have in the room, so thank you for facing the issue and wanting to hear about it. Part of what we do with Freedom Calling is this prevention work, and really it's the education piece, talking to community groups, and last year we started in the Lucia Mar School District, and it really is a privilege to be able to go in and teach both in the health classes to all of the students. They have that as part of the health, one of their tracks in the health classes, and then also to run a smaller specialist group for girls about sort of empowerment and knowing your voice, knowing your boundaries, and kind of giving your voice back. And so really that's work on the preventative side of it. And what we talk about is both what is human trafficking, but also the thing that I noticed is there's been an increase of awareness to do with what is it, but sometimes that can lead to fear and lead to lots of the questions are sort of, the mindset is that maybe my daughter's going to be kidnapped, maybe she's going to be thrown in a van, should I let her walk to school, some of those sort of things. And so actually a big part of the piece in education is sort of how this happens. And Oprah talked a lot on that this morning, and those are some of the things that we talk about is the trickery, how the targeting takes place, the trickery, and then the trauma, and then also the different types of pimping. And really, Romeo pimping is huge, especially among teenagers, and also the CEO, make quick money fast. And so when we talk about awareness and education, it's important not just to think about what is happening, but really how is this happening, and how are our teenagers being trapped and being tricked. And part of that is also to do with the vulnerabilities. That's why teenagers are sort of a key area. I know that because I was one myself, and not so long ago. And for me, even coming from a sort of stable, healthy family home, I found myself in a relationship with a guy who I thought was a dream man, and actually it led to a complete violation. And it was very humbling to think, actually, if at any moment he wanted, I too could have been on the street. And sometimes we think that this is an issue that's sort of above ourselves, and we think, oh, how could someone find themselves in that situation? But the tactics and the strategies behind it are very, very clever, and so the starting point is that we need to be openly talking about those things, and also talking about the sort of the factors that drive exploitation, and a big one of that is vulnerabilities. Oprah touched on sort of the different people groups that are vulnerable. And my work first started actually in Southeast Asia, working in the Philippines and in Thailand and in a home in the Philippines. And a lot of the women that we worked with there, the reason that they were being trafficked, the reason that they were being targeted was because of physical needs that they had, the need for food, the need for water, the need to feed their children. And so they were brought into the cities with promises of a better life that way. And so when I first came to the States in 2014, I thought, well, these sort of vulnerabilities aren't as present. Yes, in some cases, and with runaways and people living on the street, etc. But really, what are the vulnerabilities that we see here? And those vulnerabilities are the need for belonging, the need for love, for safety, and those are things that as a community we can actually meet. We can meet, each of you can go from here and you can meet them among your friends, with your families, with your social groups, with the organizations, with the school. If we can start to meet some of those areas, then we decrease the vulnerability, and therefore I believe will decrease the risks and the chances of exploitation. And so thank you for taking this first step and just being aware, and that's sort of the piece that we're doing is talking about this issue in that way.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, Mr. Cunningham, thank you for getting here. I appreciate it. I know your schedule is very busy. You've been a long-time champion in the fight against human trafficking. You've taken on responsibility in Sacramento to provide the tools necessary for these people and their colleagues throughout the state to effectively battle human trafficking. Can you give us an overview of the work you and your staff have done in Sacramento and address some of the challenges we face in the future?
Absolutely. Thank you all for being here to discuss this incredibly important issue. And we have the opportunity, if we are smart and diligent and committed, to save lives. That's my first point. The legislative battle against human trafficking is ongoing. We've made some good progress this year, I think. And to me, you need a three-part strategy. You've got to provide support and protection for the victims, as we've heard already today, how critical that is. You've got to work on the supply side by catching and imprisoning the traffickers. And this is an international crime, by the way. And this is also a gang crime. The sheriff's right. I mean, fighting trafficking is fighting gangs, and fighting gangs is fighting trafficking. That's the modern world. And we're seeing it even as close as Santa Maria and MS-13 moving into this space. And the third part is fighting the demand side. And I'm glad to hear that touched on, because that gets forgotten a lot. Do you know that today, under California law, if you solicit a minor for a sex act who is a victim of trafficking, and you know both things, that they're a minor and a victim of trafficking, you do not have to register as a sex offender. I am not kidding. I carried a bill to change that, so if you get convicted of soliciting a minor who's a victim of trafficking and you knew both things, you have to register as a sex offender. That bill got killed. Thank you. Hold your applause. That bill was killed in the Assembly Public Safety Committee this year. And I will be back next year, and I have a commitment from the ACLU to work with me to try to get a bill to make that change in law. But just to give you that example, that this, as much as we may agree in this room, it is still a fight legislatively. We've done some good things, though. I passed a bill that would make it easier to introduce victim statements at trial. That was sponsored by the DA's Association. The governor signed that bill into law this year. I passed a bill that would provide a 10-year protective order for victims of labor trafficking. Just like sex trafficking, they need a 10-year protective order. What we're seeing, and this came out of a case in San Diego County, a trafficker got sentenced to 5 or 7 years. They went in, they did their prison time. The victim only got a 3-year restraining order. And guess what that trafficker did? They came right out of prison, found the same victim, put him back on the streets. So we need to change that. I'm proud to say that bill that would give that 10-year protective order so the victims can rebuild their lives away from their abusers has passed and is sitting on the governor's desk right now. And I'm hopeful that he will sign that. So we've got some other accomplishments. The front lines of this problem are, in a lot of ways, is actually the hotels, motels, and the lodging industry. The legislature passed a bill this year to require training for hotel and motel workers to recognize the signs. The National Tip Line, which is working wonderfully, by the way, except for one little thing. Sometimes these poor kids, a quarter of trafficking victims, 1/4 are children. Okay, a lot of these victims, they can't make a phone call. They're under that kind of watchful eye. They can sneak away and make a text message, though. They can text the National Tip Line. So we're changing the tip line so it can intake text messages as well as phone calls. And we're going to save lives with that. And the last thing, I think, in addition to making sure we're working on the demand side and going after the folks that are soliciting and fueling this horrible industry, we need grant programs so that DA's offices, like San Luis Obispo County, which are on a corridor, 101, that don't necessarily have 300 DAs so that they can specially assign 4 people to go after trafficking exclusively. We need grant programs for vertical prosecution. And so we made some progress this year. I'm hopeful that either in next year's budget or this year in the legislation the governor hopefully will sign, we can provide the tools that they need to, because, you know, for those of you who don't know, vertical prosecution means The same DA is involved in the investigation, building rapport with that victim. I mean, testifying is, for these folks, is an act of incredible courage, incredible bravery. And a lot of them don't speak English, and they're taught by their abusers to not trust anybody in law enforcement and to not trust the system. They're told if you talk, if you tattle on me, you're going to get sent back to your home country. I mean, it's a very, very sick thing. So the more we can provide support for our DA's offices, like SLO County, like Santa Barbara County, who would be beneficiaries of these kind of grants, to assign prosecutors exclusively to that. That model's worked wonderfully, by the way, with anti-gang efforts. The gang task force model has really done a lot of good. So those are our challenges. We've done some good things so far. We've got a lot left to do. Thank you for being here.
So Sheriff Parkinson, maybe you could take just a brief moment and talk about the efforts and some of the strategies your department is doing about the hotels and thing.
Well, I just want to start and say, bring it back to what the Assemblyman Cunningham just said about task force and partnerships. You know, every single police department in this county is part of our gang task force in some way, either by contributing a member or contributing funds to keep it active. I bring that up because every single city, every single unincorporated area in this county has hotels. So it's equally important that they're fully engaged in this operation to begin with themselves, that they're fully aware and engaged in identification of what might be occurring in those hotels under their very noses. It's the education part starts with us. It starts with the task force being involved. It starts with the city police departments, the deputy sheriffs out there, understanding how big the issue is and to be able to respond appropriately. We don't often get calls from hotels that they believe that they have human trafficking occurring. That's not the types of calls we're getting. We're getting calls of disturbances. We're getting calls of noise. We're getting calls of traffic. It's related all to that issue potentially, but it's going back and telling and educating our hotels in each city, in each county unincorporated area, what to look for and what to report. It goes back to that, if it doesn't smell right, it's probably not right. And teaching them that they're not going to have somebody check in and say, hey, I'm going to have a lot of activity in this room over the next 2 days. That's just not going to happen. We want them to report things that don't feel right. An adult male checking in to the hotel with 2 younger females is suspicious. It should be suspicious. Now, could that be a parent with 2 children? Absolutely. But if the behavior does not support that, then it's suspicious. We much rather go out on those types of calls and contact them and find out if we have a victim there than not get the call. I think part of the process is pushing this, the willingness to make a call to us and say that I have something that is not quite there. The Assemblyman mentioned about the hotline. It's great, a great system. We also have a hotline here, and this is, I'm not pushing our app, but I'm going to. We created an app about 6 months ago, a sheriff's app. It's free. It's just in your app store like everywhere else. The reason why we did that, the reason why I was really big into that, I've heard it come up already. We live in a generation of this. And, you know, I started this job and we didn't have computers. And I have two grown sons, and I used to catch the younger one under the kitchen table texting without even seeing it. That's the type of technology we have. Having that available, so the purpose of the app and bringing it back to the value is we have an organization called Crime Stoppers here in this county. And in Crime Stoppers, you can do two things. If you pick up the app, you can push that app button and you can call them, or you can actually go and text them. So you can text information. So I always encourage people, look, I know you're seeing something, you go, I am not really sure if this is illegal, and I don't really want to be that person that calls in on everything peeking out my window. And I would say, be that person. And if you text it in, it's anonymous, and we get that information. If you see that activity, if the hotel sees something that doesn't look right, they can text it in without being that person that is actually calling us. So there's many ways, but it starts with the fact that you're not going to see something that is, I think, overtly obvious. It's going to be something very simple, and the more we get people reporting it, the better off we are. Our calls for service in the unincorporated area over the last 2 years have gone up. Our crime is actually down. That's a really good thing.
Great.
And I attribute that to people calling in. So I would say the most important thing for hotel owners, for hotel visitors, whether you're in this county or visiting another county, is when you see something that doesn't look right, please call it in.
A real quick follow-up on this. Are hotels in danger of retaliation?
I don't think so. We've already had some cases here in this county that are operating out of hotels, and we've seen none of that. I think that's the challenge. I think everybody feels, whether, you know, if you're a victim, that you're going to be retaliated against, period. If you're going to report it, I mean, do you want to call your neighbor who's having a very large party late at night? No, because you don't want your neighbor mad at you. The bottom line is, if you fear that, do it anonymously through the tip line. You can do that and actually alleviate, hopefully, all that fear that you might have.
Okay, great. A question here for perhaps Mr. Cunningham and Mr. Dowd. Mr. Dowd, you wrote an article in the Tribune recently about Assembly Bill 1810. Could you maybe just say a couple of words about the loophole, and maybe Mr. Cunningham could talk about the progress on that?
So the mental health diversion?
Yes.
So Assembly Bill 1810 was passed as a part of the budget process in June, and it immediately became effective July 1st when the budget essentially went into law. And it didn't get the same kind of discussion in front of committees and the opportunity for the public to weigh in on it. What it did was it created a program where anyone who has a mental health diagnosis in the DSM-5, essentially, which is the manual with tons and, you know, many different diagnoses, which includes caffeine addiction, it includes attention deficit disorder, a lot of kind of things that we would consider a lot more innocuous. It allows a person to ask the court, if they're charged with a crime, to be diverted out of the court system and not prosecuted for a period of 2 years while they get mental health treatment. And it sounds fantastic, and believe me, I want those that are in our criminal justice system with mental illness to get treatment for their mental illness. That needs to happen. But this bill was passed without the right kind of discussion that would have, I think, made it a better bill. And so our California District Attorneys Association and other law enforcement groups were working to try to get some changes to this, because it didn't exclude a lot of offenses. It didn't exclude murder and rape and a lot of these other offenses. So there's a new Senate bill after the 1810 became law, July 1st. Senate Bill 215 came before the Assembly and the Senate and was passed. It corrected a lot of the issues that we wanted to have. But one of the things, for instance, that was not corrected is if you're diverted, so the people that are eligible for this diversion are people that are mentally ill, and it also requires that they have a criminal case. So we know that it's some kind of mostly a violent act with mental illness, and if they're diverted, there was no provision to prevent them from possessing a firearm. So here I am, a guy that, you know, personally, I'm a pretty strong supporter of the Second Amendment. I'm not ashamed of that, but I believe very strongly that we need to look at ways of protecting the community, the thing that we should all be able to agree on is that those with mental illnesses who have committed crimes should be the first ones that we don't allow to possess firearms. That was not yet fixed. So I'm hopeful that Mr. Cunningham, along with his colleagues, will get that fix made this next year. But it's an example of how difficult sometimes it is to get things that we think are common sense fixes to get passed through the legislature. And I'm not criticizing the people, but the process is one that's very difficult because there are different competing ideas, competing thoughts, and also people want to be the one to come up with the idea, and if somebody else did, maybe they'll vote it down because it wasn't their idea, that sort of thing. So that's why I'm glad that we have an assemblyman who's working really hard on these things across party lines to get important public safety legislation passed.
Just to follow up briefly on that, Dan's exactly right. It's a good example of why it is not really usually a good idea to make major policy changes through the budget process, because you lose the ability to have committees vet legislation and think of things like, oh wait, if we're diverting people because of mental illness, what are they going to come out of that process still able to possess firearms that they would not otherwise have if they were convicted in the normal course of criminal law. So he's right. I've talked to Senator Bell, who carried AB 1810, legislation I did not support, and not because, like Mr. Dow, I strongly believe that in the appropriate case, mental health diversion is an important component, but I think this list was quite overbroad, and the DSM-5 is quite overbroad. I actually didn't know that my caffeine addiction could qualify me for get out of jail free, but good to know. I'll keep going to Starbucks. But these things need to be vetted carefully, and we've seen a lot of changes to our criminal justice system in this last year. They've eliminated the bail system, which I think is going to be bad for public safety. They watered down firearm enhancements, and like Mr. Dow, I'm a Second Amendment supporter, but guess what? If you carry a gun into a house or a bank or a business and you wave it in somebody's face, you're endangering everybody around you and yourself. And you need to have an enhancement on your sentence for that conduct. So that's been watered down. I think Senator Bell is open to making some of the fixes that we're going to need to see after AB 1810. The Senate bill, which we did pass at the very end of August, at the end of the legislative year, I'd say maybe fixed half of it, but there's a lot more that needs to be cleaned up. So that's my summary.
All right. We'll go ahead and give that to Bex. I'll change this back to education. So a question was asked, currently in the schools, I know you don't know all the schools and things, but are there programs to help our kids not look for love in all the wrong places?
I think each school has their different programs and different groups that come in, and so I know that as part of the Lucy Amar district, that's one of the things that our group to girls does teach about, and healthy relationships.
I'm sorry, what's that group?
And it's an empowerment group, specifically to girls.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I would presume within the health classes there would be some element of that, but I know there's different groups in different schools which are helping educate on that front.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mr. Dow, what is the legal penalty for purchasing a minor?
Well, it really depends. The law we've got many different penal code sections that might apply considering the specific facts. Soliciting a minor, and you know that person is a minor, carries one sentence. But I want to focus in on the newer sections for human trafficking. Human trafficking can apply to a purchaser or the trafficker. If you purchase the person and you know that they're a victim of human trafficking, and if we have coercion, fraud, deceit, fear, other things, manipulation, other things used in either the purchase or the trafficking of a person under 18, we can actually get 15 years to life in state prison if we can prove all of these various elements. So it can be anything from a 3-year prison sentence if we can't prove all of those things, all the way up to 15 years to life in prison for the Penal Code Section 236.1, which is relatively new. I think it passed and was put into law about 5 or 6 years ago. To give you an example of a couple of cases that we had here, how many of you heard of the firefighter Oscar Higueros in Cayucos a few years back? Mm-hmm. So that firefighter victimizing a minor here in our county is now serving 167 years to life in state prison. And that's because of the great work of the sheriff's office. In fact, the deputy sheriff who got a tip from a girlfriend of this victim said, hey, there's something going on with my girlfriend and I'm worried about her. This deputy went and talked with the victim, and rather than just hearing a little bit of something that didn't constitute a crime initially, he was concerned and did continuing investigation. And he was able to develop that case, and that case ended up resulting in search warrants that found a lot of that electronic evidence we talked about, including child porn, videos that this guy had taken of his victim, some horrible, horrible facts that things like what Opal talked about. Can't even imagine that happening anywhere in the world, but it happened right here in our community, not too far from here. And he's now serving 167 years to life. But that's because of the fact that the evidence was collected in a way that we could prove a lot of different criminal counts. And the companion case, another person from San Francisco who came down here is serving 60 years to life. He was a 290 registrant, a prior sex offender, and he actually was the one that sold this young victim to Mr. Higueros, the firefighter, but we didn't have enough evidence to get any more than 61 years for him, but he's serving 61 years in state prison. So it can run the gamut. If it's a relatively minor case where we don't have a lot of evidence to prove multiple acts, it may be as low as 3 years in state prison because we don't have an aggravated case where we can prove a lot of the other horrible things. But there are other forms of crime like contacting a minor through the internet. There's a section where if someone is just doing the texting back and forth or sending them an email or a FaceTime thing and trying to entice them to do a sexual act, we can prosecute that if the facts are there to support it. And that could be up to 3 years in state prison or more if there are aggravating factors. But it's very complex, and so there's not one size that fits all, but we will look at all of the evidence and we'll charge as much of the conduct that we can in hopes that we can build a very strong case and get an appropriate sentence no matter what the facts are.
Great.
I'm going to make a comment for Jordan. Worldwide, Switzerland is having the greatest success in counteracting it. That's because they have criminalized traffickers and decriminalized those who are providing the sex. And that is a procedure that has produced greatest amount of. So I don't know whether that would be possible in this country, but Switzerland is having the greatest success. And the other thing I want to comment about education, all the Rotarians that are in this town and anybody related to school system, we need to start education program beginning with middle school. Parents need to be aware of the fact what their children are doing on their computer. Traffickers are looking for words like, I'm lonely. As soon as that happens, trafficker picks it up. Nobody loves me. Trafficker picks it up. They need to not just give a cell phone to a child and forget it. Our parents are not aware of what's going on. We need to, Rotarians, please support education program starting with middle school and high school. And if you are associated with the school system, it is, I believe there is a law that in the school system they need to provide this education. And I know Santa Barbara hasn't implemented it. So most counties have not implemented it, and it is very much needed.
Go ahead and pass to Mr. Dow. Mr. Dow, could you expand a little bit? You mentioned something about a forensic task force. Could you kind of expand what that actually entails?
Sure. So a year ago in April, I guess it's been a year and a half now, we opened up the Central Coast Cyber Forensic Laboratory, and we got a very small grant from the Department of Justice to help us with buying some equipment and some software. But I've assigned 3 personnel from the DA's office, 2 investigators and 1 lab manager to work at this lab it's located at the Camp San Luis Obispo in the secure National Guard facility there. It's kind of twofold. One, it's also becoming a training center for law enforcement all over the state. But for us locally, we have kind of a task force model where the sheriff has sent his investigator, who's a cyber computer forensic technician, to work out of that lab. The San Luis Obispo Police Department has done the same. The other agencies within the county, Atascadero, Paso, Arroyo Grande, Pismo, Morro Bay has access to it. All of the police agencies can come and bring their digital devices that they seize in a case and have either our staff do the forensic extraction and then analyze that information to collect evidence for a case, or they can work with our staff. Our staff can help train them on how to do it. But it's a one location under one roof where we have multiple types of technology, including different hardware and software. So depending on what your device is, it could be a Surface Pro full computer that's a tablet, or it could be a phone, it could be your Fitbit that you're wearing, or an Apple Watch. They all contain electronic information. In fact, your car, if you have a car that's been made within the last 10 years, it has a computer on board. That computer has information. Some of them have GPS information and the tracking your speed and all of that stuff. In the right case, if we have the right ability to pull that computer off that car, we can extract that data, analyze it, and see how it supports the evidence that we have in a case. So that's been a partnership locally, and I'm glad that the sheriff's a part of that, every one of our police agencies, and it provides a chance for us to fully investigate all of the cases that we have.
I just want to add on to that for just a moment. It's this idea was really led by the DA in forming this task force. A lot of what they do is analyzing the digital devices after the fact. That's their job, which is an incredible tool for, as Dan mentioned. The other thing we have at my office is we have one full-time position and one half-time position, and they're dedicated to really 2 things. One, they work in the internet field of identifying people out there that are downloading and searching child pornography. So the good news is that they're identifying these people, and they're tracking them down, and they're building cases on their activity. Second of all, these are potential suspects in this type of crime of human trafficking. I heard the mention about the internet, and quite honestly, when you hear those stories of the internet, you want to walk home and just shut it off and never turn it on again. And or do not provide your son, grandson, granddaughter with those devices. I want to mention that, though, for just a second, because it's really important. A lot of this stuff, a lot of the activity is done through the internet. The solicitation for services, the solicitation for actually getting a hold of these victims and bringing them in. And you have, your sites such as Facebook or Instagram or some of these others where these people are building fictitious sites. And this is not them with their picture on it. This is either another young child, it could be from the same sex, building that rapport and relationship through conversation. The young 14-year-old girl that gets a friend request from what appears to be a 15, 16, 17-year-old male who is building this, and she's a young girl, he's a cute guy, and now they have this internet relationship. Come to find out, that's a 35-year-old male or 45-year-old male that's really enticing them into a meeting or something more, sending pictures. It's the beginning of it. So this person and a half team, they primarily work that, and the other part of their job is working, that Jordan brought up earlier, our sex registrants, our reoffenders, checking on them, inspecting what they're doing, making sure that they're not out there doing it. That's why that registration is so vital, because if they don't register, if we don't know who they are, they could move into our area with no restrictions. Right now, if somebody has to register and they move from my area in the county into the chief's area here in Morro Bay, they have to go in and register with them. So they know that this person not only is a registrant, but what kind of crimes they committed before. And that's extremely important.
Great. Let's go ahead and bring it back to education here, Rex. What I'd like to, or we have a question here. Can you expand a little bit on the success of the Lucia Mar, kind of what the feedback, the parents, what you're getting from the parents and the kids, and how can we get that into other schools? Are we working to do that as well?
Yeah, I mean, as far as we're concerned, we're definitely looking to get it into other schools. That really comes from the school district themselves and those working in it. So we were invited into the Lucia Mar by the student advocate who was working there. And so I would just encourage each of you to go to your school. I think Deepa mentioned this, but there is part of it which is mandated, that it is meant to being taught in the health classes about human trafficking. So if it's not, I would encourage you to go to your schools and ask them, and I think it's a sort of an individual school basis in terms of going in and teaching. We're definitely willing, and there's a few other organizations also who are willing to do that. In terms of the feedback, I think the feedback from the parents so far has been very positive. I think when we address it, that's what I was talking about, saying about how this is happening, and I think the caution is just not to go on the fear front of what's happening, but really educating, okay, what are the conversations that you can have with your teenagers? We would love to talk more directly to the parents. There's information that goes out to them, and the students, for the most part, are receptive, and I think the thing that's important is the practical information of, okay, we're getting them to think about who are the safe people in your life, what could you do, setting up scenarios for them, because a lot may not think about it, and it's better for them to think about it and work out the options for them before they're presented with a situation. And then the last thing that I just wanted to touch on with that as well, in the education, and the education part is talking about this so we can build a intolerance to the things that drive the demand factor. For example, we talk about what is acceptable on social media, what are the things you want to be watching, listening to, because we can educate in our schools, and that's one piece of education, but really a lot of people are being educated by media, by the things they're watching, the things they're listening to, and so encouraging teenagers, but also encouraging each of us to just think seriously and think about what is it that we want to feed and educate ourselves with.
Great. We'll go ahead. It's time to wrap it up. I think I have one more for Mr. Cunningham. So, of course, you travel all around your district, and you hear lots of these things. For us, as I was kind of putting this together, I considered you kind of the miner's hardware of this group. You're the one that provides the tools for these to all do there. So I thought I'd give you the last couple of minutes here just for some final thoughts.
I like that metaphor. No, I think we have challenges in legislating in this area and providing resources. It's really, you've got to have a legal system and a structure and laws that keep up with quickly evolving technology. And that can be difficult to do. And one area that I carried a bill this year, because getting onto the education piece for a moment, our school districts, there's in sex ed curriculum for high schools and middle schools, there are defined lists of things you're allowed to talk about. A couple years ago, they were able to add human trafficking to that list, which is a great thing. We don't have full compliance yet from all the school districts. We're still trying to get that phased in. That's important that we do that. One thing that was not part of the approved list of what you could talk about, as I discovered with a case that was brought to me by a constituent from San Miguel School District, is the sharing of sexually explicit materials using phones and electronic devices. This is going on a lot more than any of us want to think about. There was a CNN national study that determined that up to 24% of teenagers had used an electronic device, most commonly a phone, to share explicit pictures. Okay, that's frightening. That's totally frightening. It's going on a lot more than we care to even think about. And that's a gateway into the types of behaviors that can get you into somebody's clutches. So my bill, which I hope will be signed by the governor this month, allows school districts the option to add that sort of piece, that sort of education. So we're telling kids what is appropriate and is not appropriate. And I'm not trying to be a moralist about it, but if we want to, this is the first opportunity you have to teach these kids sort of what they can do with a phone that could be very destructive to them, destructive to their reputation, and in the worst case scenario could end them, put them in a very, very compromised position in a bad spot. So I think the education piece, we're catching up. On the legal piece, I'm hopeful that when we have this next year, and I hope we do have it next year, because this is awesome to see this kind of engagement in our community, I'm able to report to you that my bill has passed and been signed into law, so we can add folks that are fueling the demand in this industry to the registry. Because as the sheriff said, I think that's probably education on the front end, and that piece on the back end is probably the single best thing we could do to try to stop this and turn the tide. I would just end with thanking everybody on this panel, and we have an awesome team in this county. And to be able to work with the sheriff and the DA to inform the laws that I'm trying to pass and figure out whether they're going to actually work on the ground, because these guys know whether they will or won't, has been a real blessing, and I plan on continuing to do it. Thank you.
I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank everybody. The questions are very, very good. I will make sure that that each individual gets the questions that we didn't get to today. But I want to thank everybody, and let's give our panelists another big round of applause.